Hello everyone, welcome back to the Sly Cooper Wiki. My name is Shrev, your usual host, and today we're finally moving on to the PAL regions. And we're starting off with the first game of the series, Sly Raccoon. Now, in front of me today I have two versions of the game, and they're both English United Kingdom versions, but they are slightly different and they do have their variations, hence why I'm covering both of them today. On the left, I have what I will be calling the ELSPA or ELSPA version, and on the right, I have what I will be calling the PEGI or the PEGI version. And that's because of the different ratings on these games. So for those of you who live in North America, you might be familiar with the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or ESRB. And in Europe, they have a different but sort of analogous rating system known as PEGI. And that's what we see here on the right. However, Sly Raccoon did release back in 2003, so things were a bit different. UK in particular were transitioning from one rating system to another, so the rating system they were using at the time was ELSPA, which is similar to PEGI. It's certainly not outdated in their ratings by any stretch, but PEGI is more universal, and it's what you're more likely to see on video games today. Consequently, the one version I have on the left, the ELSPA version, is what I'll be considering as the initial release, as this game was given the ELSPA rating, whereas the one on the right I'll be considering as a later release around 2006, and you'll see why I'm thinking that later on in this video. As for the front cover comparisons, really there's not much to say. Obviously, if you're acquainted with the North American versions, they're going to look very different. For reference, these are the North American versions, but these are the PEGI versions, so there's definitely some differences to be had there, and it's very self-explanatory. The first difference, obviously, is the fact that this game is named Sly Raccoon as opposed to Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus. I'm not quite sure why Cooper was omitted. And interestingly enough, Cooper is actually never mentioned in these games' manuals either. Again, I'm not sure why. I do not have a reason for that as of right now, but it's an interesting fact that I figured I'd point out anyways. Other than that, there's really not much else to say. The differences between the regions do speak for themselves. Moving to the spine, we see that, well, it's fairly plain. For those of you who are used to the North American region, it's a little more artistic than the European versions, that's for sure, though the European versions are a bit more standardized with this sort of plain font and the game name on it, so take that what you will. The disc ID for the PAL version is SCES-50917, and that's the case on both of these variants. Moving to the back, remember that the left is the ELSPA initial release and the right is the PEGI later release. And for the most part, the backs between these two versions are identical. The same screenshots are there, the same descriptions are there. There's not much really to say. There are a couple of minor differences. For instance, the URL on the later release omits the www, and there's a better indication that this is a United Kingdom release, as evidenced by the UK flag. The fine print on the later release is also different. It mentions copyright 2006 for whatever reason, hence my theory that this was released around 2006. Otherwise, it wouldn't really make too much sense to include such a copyright year. The copyright year on the left was 2002, which makes sense since the games released in North America in 2002 and made their way to Europe in 2003. Other than that, really, there's not much else to say. It's obviously very different from the backs of the North American releases. The presentation is obviously very different than the North American release. There's only one screenshot that both of these versions have in common, and that's Sly swinging from a hook, but the other two screenshots are different than the other three screenshots on the North American version. So that's really all there is to say about the back. And now we move inside. Moving to the inside, we see that the similarities here are quite abundant. The Thievius Raccoonus in both games is identical, and the front cover is also identical to the North American version. They're both Thievius Raccoonuses, or whatever the plural of that word is. The discs on both of these are almost similar. There is a interesting difference in the disc ID. For whatever reason, the later release outlines its disc ID on the disc in white, and it's followed by a pound sign or a hashtag, whereas the disc ID on the initial release is in black and doesn't have that hashtag at all. If you guys live in the PAL regions and have any ideas as to why this may be, definitely do let me know in the comments down below. I'd be very grateful for your input. Besides that, however, the discs are identical, including the contents on the actual discs themselves. For those of you curious about the disc art, that disc art is actually identical to the disc art on the initial release of Sly Cooper and the Devious Raccoonist, that is the Black Label release. You'll remember that the disc art on the Red Label Greatest Hits release is different than the other three here, but the initial North American release and both PAL releases all share the same disc art of Sly leaping from the rooftops in the shadows. So that's pretty cool. Before we move on to the manual, I do want to point out something that the initial PAL release gets that the later PAL release does not get, and that's an insert advertising a PlayStation 2 memory card as well as the slyschool.com website. This isn't present with the later PAL release, and I can confirm that because I did get the later release brand new, so it didn't come with that insert. I suppose it makes sense since at that point you probably have a PlayStation 2 memory card anyways. The manuals between releases are almost identical. Their differences are about as profound as they were on the back covers of both of these games, and they're just very minor. The first big difference, I suppose, is since the later release was rated by the PEGI system, there is a PEGI breakdown in the manual jacket that is absent from the initial release, and the manual also clarifies that it is the English version. This isn't explicitly mentioned at the beginning in the initial release, though it is pretty obvious once you get to actually reading the manual. But it is interesting nonetheless, and I suppose this might have to do with some sort of regulations, though I could be very wrong. There's another difference in the manual that's minor. It's not groundbreaking, but it was interesting to see this difference, as it was something I didn't expect, and it's mainly a formatting difference. So the initial release has its paragraph like this, whereas the later release has its paragraph like this. It's the same info, it's just an odd line break for no apparent reason, which made me wonder if they edited any more of this manual, but they didn't. They just edited whatever like the important parts were, such as that PEGI regulation release or the phone numbers in the back. Speaking of the phone numbers, the back of the PAL manuals include phone numbers for customer support, and this list in the later release has been updated. As you can imagine, it probably changes with time, so these numbers had to be updated to make sure that they were still accurate by the time the later release actually released. So there's that difference, but really not much else to say. The back of the manual has the same difference in the URL as the back of the game actually did, where the www is omitted. Again, not quite sure why. It's a minor difference, but one nonetheless. And that's really all there is to the differences between these retail releases. There are ever so minor differences that pop up here and there, but overall you're getting the same package. Now, for those of you wondering how these manuals differ from the North American releases, that's a little more difficult. So the manuals themselves are presented very differently, but they do convey the same info and almost the same wording. There are obviously a lot of differences in wordings. Some controls are changed up, some languages modified a little bit for whatever reason, but the info is still there and it's presented in almost the same order. Though if you guys are interested in really looking at both manuals side by side, there is, as usual, a high quality scan of the manual, the disc, and the jacket in the description down below, so you guys can look at that and inspect it to your heart's content. One thing I will say that the PAL people missed out on were these cool drawings in the North American manual. These are nowhere to be seen in the PAL manual. Maybe it was a cost-cutting measure to make sure that there were less pages, I'm not sure, but these drawings of Sly and his ancestors' moves show up every once in a while in these manuals. but they're nowhere to be seen in the PAL manual. So I thought that was a little interesting to point out. Obviously, there are very many more minor differences, but that was one difference that stuck out to me for whatever reason. And with that, that brings us to the end of our very first PAL unboxing. If you guys enjoyed this video, feel free to hit that like button. If you're new here and want to see more unboxings like this, definitely do subscribe. We have a lot more of these games in the pipeline, so definitely stay tuned for that. And let us know in the comments down below what you guys thought of these differences. Was there anything that you wish that your region had gotten that another region did, or is there something that you thought was interesting? Definitely let us know in the comments down below. Additionally, let me know how you guys want to see these comparisons. This was sort of a rough run. I did try to point out whatever differences I could, but if there's anything you guys want to see in particular when we do cover these sort of differences, definitely let me know and I will try to accommodate for that. And of course, if you guys want us to unbox something sooner rather than later, also let me know and I will see what I can do. As always, this has been Shrev of the Sly Cooper Wiki, your #1 resource for anything and everything Sly Cooper. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. The manuals themselves are identical. There is a